So we are going to have our first podium discussion now. First we have a couple of short presentations to introduce the topic, and the topic is going to be, do real estate markets lead to unjust cities? So we just heard already in the keynote from Dirk Messner that there's going to be a huge demand for investment, for finance in the future, for infrastructure, for housing, for commercial development. And the question is, of course, how is this going to be provided? And we have seen in the past that a lot of this money has come from global finance. So the term financialization of housing is actually today much bandied around, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the impact of this kind of globalization of financing of real estate, of housing. We're also going to talk about the road forward, where we are going to go. And we have a very distinguished podium today. I'm very happy that everybody made it here despite the storm and the chaos at Berlin Airport. So we have, on the one hand, we have Stephan Bone-Winkel. He is, you see it up there, he's the CEO of his own, can I put it like that, real estate development company, specialization on commercial property. Then we have Saskia Sassen, who's professor for real estate development, no, for sociology in Columbia. Sorry, I should take a look. I was trying to be courageous and didn't pay off. Okay, and then we have Joseph Schechla, who's the coordinator of Housing and Land Rights Network of the Habitat International. And I'm going to say a little bit more about each of our presenters before they present, and then we also have a short video address by Leilani Farha. Confused, it's too warm. It's really warm up here. Now I understand, actually, Dirk Messner. Down there it's really nice in comparison. Who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing. And we have a short video address by her, but we start with the keynote presentation by Saskia Sassen. And now coming to her correct CV. Lind, professor of sociology at Columbia University. She's the member at Columbia University of the Committee of Global Thought. She has received a number of different prizes, is a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences in the Netherlands, and there's too much to go on, but we're really looking forward very much to your presentation. Thank you for making the way over.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've really enjoyed the talks. I think the subject is incredibly important. I just would like to make a little comment about the notion that real estate markets are either good or bad. Real estate markets are a very, very broad variable, and in many ways there are some real estate markets that function very, very well. I just want to emphasize that I don't see it this way. What I'm going to be talking about is really the buying of property by major investors, and the buying of property with a very low utility function. So the question is, what am I seeing? We have in London, we have in New York City, and in a bunch of other cities, a lot of big towers that are dark, they're empty. And so my question is, why? Why are they being bought? And one framing of an answer, and I want to emphasize one framing of an answer, is that this is a way of storing capital with some very negative effects on cities. But so when I was doing my research on the global city way back in the 1980s, there was a lot of buying by foreigners, like the Japanese, even the Dutch, who were right there, were buying many buildings in London, in the financial center. But there was a very strong utility function, because London's financial center was the ultimate platform to access all kinds of other markets. And that strong utility function is what is lacking here. Now, here are a few, actually before doing this, I just want to to just 2 minutes on the city. So it seems to me that in the Middle Ages, and maybe even up to 30 years ago, if you saw very, very dense, built-up environment, you knew that was a city. I would argue that today, we may see some very dense built environments. We need to interrogate, is this urbanizing or de-urbanizing the space it occupies? The city, if you want, the city is a complex but incomplete system. And in that mix of complexity and incompleteness lies the capacity of cities to actually outlive other formal systems that are closed, government systems, big corporations. When you take any of our big cities, there are going to be all kinds of extraordinarily powerful actors, whether firms or forms of government, that are gone. But what has stayed there is urban space with its variabilities. So I think that is very important. Now, final point just to frame, it seems to me, I repeat, that today many concentrations of buildings, of high-rise buildings especially, are de-urbanizing space. They're often privately guarded spaces. They are, police, militarized, whatever, and they are places where, say, low-wage workers go in, do their job, and get out. In a real city, low-income people can make a history, a culture, a neighborhood economy. So a city is marked by extraordinary diversities and the possibility of making. And coming from, I grew up in Latin America, where the poor, the fighting poor, they have this beautiful phrase, which is, estamos presentes. Power, we are present. We're not asking you for anything. We are just letting you know that this is also our city. In many of these private, gated, forests of towers, that cannot happen. You can have a job, you cannot make a history, you cannot make a culture. You go back to your neighborhood, and if you're lucky, there you can do it. So this is just to frame. Now, the project that I want to briefly address has to do with the buying of property. I'm just going to show you data that is mostly about the buying of existing property. I'm looking at the top 100 cities in the world. Berlin, by the way, ranks rather high. I think 16 or something like that on this list. This includes cities of China, cities in Australia, cities not so much in Latin America, that's beginning to show. And so the notion is existing property, not building. Building is also happening, but that's a slightly different story. So here you have, I cannot show you the top 100 clearly. Here you have the top 10. Just to clarify, the numbers is the actual value of property bought, minimum price, I say 5 million in the case of major Western cities. When you move to other parts of the world, the minimum price might be a bit lower. But these data include only that. And it's just 1 year. These figures refer to the change from the prior year. Every year, we do this thing. So as you can see, New York, who always likes to be number one anyhow, is at the top. Now, this is not a positive, you understand, necessarily. It has to be interrogated. If you take a longer list, etc., then you get this kind of distribution. You see that it actually narrows down. This is only foreign investment. In other words, in a city like London, there is a lot of foreign buying. And just as a datum, footnote type datum, the Qatari royals, and nothing against them, by the way, now own more of central London than the Queen of England. I mean, I love that datum. I don't know if you can see why. But, and neither one is an angel, huh? And the main buyer, the main owner, of course, is the old Westminster, Lord of Westminster, who has existed for 800 years in different incarnations. Power does not take you beyond. So, and here is that other distribution you can see when it comes to foreign investors, they like to stick close to the top to the Queens. Now here are just the data I've just extracted. These are the numbers. Berlin. I just took the German cities that are on the top 100. What is quite interesting is that Berlin has a very high figures. You can see 11 billion. Again, that's just buying property. Huh? But it's falling down compared to the prior year. The prior year, it was even more. Hamburg, is Hamburg written with an O in there or just U, no? Yeah, that is, I just see that. I'm just copied it from that list, so I apologize for that. So you can see Hamburg, it has a far higher rate of growth. Now that, you know, this is basically property, not necessarily big industrial sites. I don't know what would happen. Now, compared with that, I just brought in Nanjing. So if you take China, Shanghai and Berlin and Beijing are actually losing because they have received so much investment. Nanjing is gaining 142%. You see the same thing like that, say, with Amsterdam. Amsterdam is still growing very, very fast, faster than, so the thing that I showed, 242% over the past year, because these are sort of new objects of desire, we might say. Now, here is something that has to do with, here you have the description, with flight capital, which really is going into buying high-end properties. And so, oopsie, oh, I lost my slide. You can go back with this slide? The bottom. Oh, the bottom. Okay. So we are there. Let's just move on. Now, one question that I want to engage, this is sort of the theorist in me, is here we have very material events. Can we actually see what is happening? How much does the material tell us? We tend to think that if it's material, it's there. It has speech. You know, it is what it is. So here I love to show this image. So this is the center of London, very, lots of tourists. And I rarely am there, actually. But I had to do an interview with a journalist. We went walking, and I heard all these tourists saying, oh, look at these lovely, lovely British buildings. Ooh, ooh. Well, all of these buildings are owned by one foreign company. It doesn't matter, it's a Chinese company, but that's secondary. The Chinese are the main buyers nowadays in a lot of places. The point is that the material, under the current conditions with instruments that are quite abstract, you know, in a way these buildings operate both as building, on the ground, building, and they operate as an object for financializing. So there is an ambiguity about this, but I just want to come back to the notion that even the material moment doesn't quite tell you the full story, because it's in a way is a history that installs itself in these buildings. Now, this is another, I'm going to skip because I don't have time, but it's a nice story. Here, I just wanted to very quickly, just to explain why I sort of selected out this one example of the Chinese. The Chinese are the main investors in the world. It doesn't matter what, whether it is building new mines in behind Rio de Janeiro, whether it is. So that is why they are often mentioned. This is not about, you know, singling out a group. Now, the 100 top cities that I'm looking at, by property buying, investment is not necessarily, it's buying, account for 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, and here, very tricky figure, 76% of property investment. That figure, because remember, we're ultimately talking about a very small number of buildings here, compared to all the buildings in the world. So this is the financializing. So these particular buildings represent a fairly high, 76% share of all the buildings that operate not only as buildings, but also as, if you want, food for the financializing of a whole variety of conditions. So this is a quite, just in case it isn't self-evident, this is a rather high share. Now, Savills, there I was in Phnom Penh trying to get some data, and I went to the experts, nobody had the data, Savills did. They are a massive commercial operation. according to them, and I would say that they know their stuff, according to them, worldwide real estate assets, again, that's also a financialized condition, represent together 217 trillion. That figure is more than the global GDP of all the countries in the world. So again, what I want to emphasize is that these buildings are functioning not just as buildings, not just as real estate markets, they're also functioning as something else. And one way of putting it is food for finance. Because ultimately, and here, if I may footnote, traditional banking is commerce. It sells something for a price. It sells you money for an interest rate. High finance and this financializing of these buildings sells something in a way, or you might just say that about high finance. High finance, one way of putting it, is sells something it does not have. And in selling what it, is that the clock for me to stop? Okay, very good. And in selling what it does not have, it on the one hand develops extraordinarily brilliant instruments that secondly allow it to invade all kinds of sectors and extract whatever the values they want. So for instance, nowadays, if you go into Goldman Sachs, you know, a famous financial firm, right? And I'm talking now about Manhattan, the back room, which is where the secretaries used to sit, is now full of physicists. We're dealing with algorithmic math. This is radically different from traditional banking. And that is why, yes, there is the building and then there is that other sphere. And it is that other sphere that should cause us, you know, worry. Now, here is, I'm just showing you a few images here. These are 65,000 plus buildings in London that are all owned, bought, whatever, by foreign parties. We don't know what they are. There is no person there who owns. They are underused buildings, many of them, not all of them, but many of them. Here are towers. Now, these are new build towers, luxury towers, in lower Manhattan, which are actually sort of midtown Manhattan, which are mostly empty. And here is another one. And what we know is that over half of all the units are owned by shell companies. Shell companies being the term for, we don't know who it is, but I hope that is clear. So it's a bit suspect immediately, you know what I mean? And here's another one. And so my question is, what am I seeing? If they're putting all this money in there and the utility function is so low, what am I actually seeing here? And it seems to me that one of the things I'm seeing is not just the cleansing of money. We know that story, right? You can cleanse rather problematic money by buying a property. That is a very long and old story. But I think what I'm also seeing is the buying of urban land. The regime covering the buying of urban land is often old law, very different from contemporary law, and very different often from what it means to buy a building. So in many countries, it's maybe sort of a messy difference. I don't know about Germany, by the way. But in many countries, you may own the building, but you don't necessarily own the land beneath it. Now, the reason for me to make this argument that what I'm seeing partly, let's say it's one vector organizing the outcome being all this buying, is that while it is true that if you take a satellite visual of our planet, it looks like there's a lot of empty land. But when you put together, when you bring in the story of land grabs in rural areas, the Nestle's and Coca-Colas who buy land to extract water, the mining, the 35 countries who are occupying foreign countries in order to grow their food and what, then you stand back and you say, wow, there's actually very little land left. And so I'm going to skip a few things that I was going to talk about. And I just want to come to these images. And I want to suggest that both in rural areas and potentially increasingly also in the global north, we're facing a point where you have two worlds colliding. And so this is a very good image. This, by the way, is this doesn't, there's no place in the world where you can stand and see this, okay? But an artist put together, this is a real photo, La Periferia, as we call it in Latin America. So while from the satellite perspective, you see a lot of green space, de facto, we are beginning to really lose ground, lose space. Berlin and Germany in general is amazing. Europe is quite different from other parts of the world generally. But you have a sense of, and when there is not enough, well, let me finish my sentence there. You have a sense that these are formats of the future. We're headed in that direction. So that again then brings back this notion of the buying of urban land. For instance, Singapore, a couple of years ago, bought a big part of poor Detroit. Didn't make an announcement, didn't say anything. It's just waiting for the last poor black families who cannot get jobs to leave. Detroit is situated in a very desirable part of the United States. So my question is, what am I seeing? What I'm seeing is, in the future, a great, corporate center with luxury housing. But it's done in a way, with no announcement. So I don't know if I'm conveying. Anyhow, back to this, and if there isn't enough land, we're building the shanties on water. And a final point here that I want to leave you with. So the habitat, it already came up, and I think there were a lot of good things about the habitat. Habitat tried to upgrade slums. You know that more and more people live in slums, etc. And, well, all they could really do was clean up the streets. It looks sort of neat, but it clearly also facilitates the movement of tanks inside those. They couldn't touch the houses because the houses are, of course, irregular vis-à-vis the law. And the hope was, if we clean up the streets, there's a bit of a shadow effect on the housing. But I do think that it is a sort of a troubled picture. In short, things are happening in the global north, the buying of vast amounts of property with low utility functions. I want to leave you with that. And in the global south, no matter how much land there might be, there actually is a very, very rapid growth of land grabs. The estimates is that between 1 and 3 million people every year have to leave their small plots, and they have zero claims. They go to the big slums of cities, where we just see them as slum dwellers. In fact, they are the carriers of knowledge about how to keep that land alive. And I think that is really a very serious issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this really interesting big picture that the first presentation gave us about the development and also about the role of finance. Our second presentation by Stephan Bone-Winkel is going to give us kind of a second view on the same topics, this time from the real estate development perspective. And as I already said, Stephan Bone-Winkel is founded his own company, let's put it like that, the Beos AG, which is specializing real estate development of commercial areas and their transformation. He's also a professor of real estate development at the University of Regensburg and a founding member of the Society for Property Researchers. I'd leave it at that.
Thank you very much. When I got invited to this panel, I was sort of surprised first because I really like the topic, the transformative power of cities, because that's what I do every day. We transform unused real estate into used real estate. We try to grow space for companies. But then when I saw the title of the panel, I was sort of thinking twice. Unjust cities or justice in cities is something I'm not really familiar with. I don't think, being an economist, that there are winners and losers in cities per se. It's all about wealth and welfare. And if I ask myself, what is unleashing the transformative power of cities? There's a very quick and simple answer. It's jobs. People move to cities because of jobs. because of safety, because of hope that they find jobs. And in all this discussion about urbanization, I miss a discussion about jobs. It's all about housing and the pressure upon the housing markets. But you know what? We have more than 1,000 companies in our space that we have throughout Germany. If I talk to the entrepreneurs, the CEOs of those companies, they have a massive problem because they're driven out of the cities, because also the value of the land is increasing so much that being just a normal entrepreneur producing things, which is still happening in Germany, fortunately, they're driven out of the city because then the developer comes and builds housing with 6 stories as opposed to 1 story and pays like 5 times the price that a normal entrepreneur is paying. And you have to know that 80% of commercial land is owned by the occupiers. So the companies, they own the land that they're working on. It's not the financial institutions that own the land. It's not like that in Germany. So sometimes the land value is much higher than the value of the business. And transformation of cities also means, in my view, that we have to conserve the space that is used for commercial companies that are producing things, because they create the jobs. And especially they have the jobs that are underpaid or with low wages. Yeah? It's not the Goldman Sachses that create the interesting jobs, but the ones that have low wages. So re-urbanization is also a key topic for companies that want to move into the city. In former times, companies were producing pollution and were having heavy traffic, a lot of logistics. But this is all changing. The companies want to move into the city. They do customized production, not large-scale production. And so the cities have to transform also in this respect. And we have to think about mixed use. The typical layout of the city is to separate uses. So there's the CBD with all the banks, there are the housing districts, there are the production areas, and this all is a thing of the past. The companies we work for, they want to mix up, they want to be as close to the urban areas that they can get to, and that is a very important topic. Let me talk about real estate market. The real estate market is not a free market. It's totally heavily regulated. The use of land is regulated by the municipality. The transfers of land is heavily taxed. The construction of buildings is heavily regulated. For instance, in Germany, it's not the case that we have just one kind of law that dictates how to build. We have a federal state, so every one of the 16 federal states has different laws on how to build space, which is really annoying me because if a building burns, it burns the same way in every sort of federal state, but we have 16 different kinds of regulations here. So the land use is regulated, and what we really see currently is that the speed is going down instead of going up. To construct something new takes more time, it gets more expensive every year. The regulation, sustainability laws is getting heavier every year. So this really creates a problem because we should move in the other direction. We should produce low-cost housing, low-cost buildings, affordable housing, affordable buildings. But in my view, from the public workforce, everybody's working against this. And let me strike one issue that is very important. If you look at capital flowing into real estate, you cannot look at real estate without looking at capital markets. So I'm working with 40 different institutional investors, most of them pension schemes. So for instance, the dentists of the city of Berlin, the lawyers of the city of Hamburg, they are all free professions and they pay monthly dues into their pension scheme, and today they have a real problem. The real problem is if they buy a 10-year bond, they have a negative interest. So they cannot do this. If they buy real estate, they have a 3, 4, 5% interest, and that's what they need. They need to pay the pensions of the people retiring from their profession. So there's a real war going on between the people retiring and the people still paying into the pension scheme. And the managing directors of the pension schemes, they have this real problem producing income. And if they cannot do this, the pension scheme doesn't work anymore. So that's why they all move into real estate, because that's the last resort where you can make some interest at least on your money. But what happens right now is they move back out of residential real estate, because what they think is it's too heavily regulated. I will not be able to produce my 2, 3, 4% interest for the retiring people, so I move back out. And why they think this is going to happen? Because regulation is increasing. New laws are coming into place regulating the rental markets. And we've seen this before. In the 1980s and 90s, new regulation has forced the German institutional investors to sell off all their residential real estate. It was all gone. The percentage of residential real estate in their portfolios was 0. What happened then was all the international institutions, the Goldman Sachs, the hedge funds moved in, they bought the large-scale residential companies. No German investor was interested. And then suddenly they saw maybe we should get back into this field again, and right now everybody's moving out again. And I think this is a problem because we need more investment in real estate, not less investment in real estate. Think about this. If we have more investment and we have a historic chance to attract the money from large-scale corporations, like the Government Investment Fund of Singapore, like China State Fund, like all the major pension funds from the US, CalPERS, we need this money to build the city and to grow the residential portfolio. And I think attracting money is not bad, it's good. We really have to enforce the people who cannot afford the rent, that they can afford the rents. We should not regulate the rents, we should empower the people, give them money to pay better rents. That should be an aim that we should have. So in Germany, ownership in residential real estate is like 40%. In other countries, like 80%. So what we really have to do to protect German tenants, residential tenants, from international capital markets is to make them buy their apartments, let them be owners instead of tenants. So, and one last remark, it's about innovation. I think it's very, very important that we drive innovation. Germany is in terms of building regulation, building standards, is leader in I would say, in that field. But we really have to think about innovating urban logistics, traffic, but also building standards, and to mix up uses and to create more density within the cities. And yeah, that was my initial remark. Thank you.
We have a short video address from, I never can pronounce that, Leilani Farha, who is the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, appointed by the United Nations. And she's also the Executive Director of Canada Without Poverty, and also been the director of the Center for Equality Rights and Accommodation in Canada, so very much focused on the social, the human rights aspect of housing, and this is also what the short address that we are going to see now is going to be about.
Hi, I'm Leilani Farha, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing. I'm so sorry I'm not able to be with you today, but I offer you my comments via video message in Geneva. The question posed for this panel is, do real estate markets lead to unjust cities? Of course, the short answer is yes. I hope and assume that Saskia has already addressed the central thesis in her book Expulsions. The human rights vantage point that I offer underscores what Saskia documents.
What I see in city after city that I visit is that housing is consistently understood and treated as a commodity, a place to park huge amounts of capital and to grow wealth. This has resulted in gross inequality, whereby huge segments of the urban population are being removed and left out. They're being evicted from their homes, they're being excluded from planning processes and development of new housing, they're being rendered homeless, living in the harshest of conditions, or living in grossly inadequate informal settlements, lacking security of tenure and subject to a host of other human rights violations. And they're being priced out of housing, unable to live in their own cities or participate, let alone compete, in corporate-driven economies that have taken over cities. Before I proceed with further comments, I want to make one thing clear. Real estate markets don't exist on their own. They are, in fact, the creation of states. They are the product of laws and regulations governing land and property rights. And this is important because states, the creators of those markets, also have human rights obligations. And those obligations should have a bearing on how they create and interact with markets. What I'm suggesting here is different than a business and human rights approach, which focuses on the direct human rights obligations that businesses have. Instead, I'm concerned with the obligations that states must impose on businesses under domestic law in order for the state to comply with its international human rights obligations. The point I emphasized in my recent report on financialization of housing is that the obligations of businesses and investors in relation to housing are to be determined, regulated, and enforced by states. If states heavily rely on private markets to meet their obligation to fully realize the right to housing for all, and most states do, then they must regulate private investment in housing consistently with that obligation. That means stopping private actors from violating human rights, for example, by illegally evicting people. But it means much more than that as well. It means states must redesign the laws and regulations that define real estate markets so that instead of developing housing for the rich only, housing is redefined as a human right, a social good, fundamental to inclusive, vibrant, diverse communities. This past Friday, a UN committee responsible for interpreting states' social and economic human rights obligations released a legal interpretation on this very issue. Referred to as General Comment Number 24, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights referenced my report to clarify that states would violate their duty to protect human rights by failing to regulate the real estate market and the financial actors operating on this market so as to ensure access to affordable and adequate housing for all. As it stands, we are a far cry away from that reality. Governments are more likely to respond to what credit agencies demand than to what human rights require. But getting there shouldn't be impossible. We have international human rights law, the right to adequate housing, the right to life, to security, and to dignity. We now have the clarity of state obligations under this law to redesign housing markets and regulate housing investment consistently with this law. And we have commitments made by all states to realize secure, adequate, and affordable housing by 2030. And what I'm seeing is that we now have a growing movement of people worldwide, all of whom know that we are on an unsustainable path and who are beginning to affirm with an increasingly unified voice that it is now time to act. Thank you.
I wish I could thank her directly. I hope the thanks will be conveyed. I think that was a very it brought a completely new dimension to what we have heard so far, the human rights dimension, which is, of course, also very, very interesting from the legal implications it could carry. Now, the last speaker that we have is Josef Schechla, and he's going to show us some steps on the way forward. He is the coordinator of the Housing and Land Rights Network of the Habitat International Coalition, which is based in Cairo, so I'm not quite sure whether he came here directly. He has also previously served as a program coordinator of the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, so that kind of fits in what we just heard before. And was the director of democratic development programs, for example, Emmett East in Washington. So we are very much looking forward to your presentation, also very curious about the different roads you show for us to go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I do want to align myself with the Special Rapporteur's comments. Far be it from me to disagree with the Special Rapporteur. But of course, what I'd like to do is unpack a little bit some of the things that she has said. And in particular, some of you may know that the Special Rapporteur has sort of given a title to this new look or this new call for a human rights perspective on housing as a human right and not a commodity. And she has called it the shift. And so to actually engage in that shift, she invites us to redefine housing as a human right, a social good, fundamental to inclusive, vibrant, and diverse communities. Vibrant and diverse communities are very much aligned with what we heard from Professor Messner, the Eigenart, that I'd like to speak of also. And just to edit a little bit what she said, however, states, I would say governments, heavily rely on private markets to meet their obligation to fully realize the right to housing for all, if in fact that is an objective. And most do rely on those markets. Then they must, in that case, they must regulate. Now, it is quite common to hear from a broad range of political parties the call for housing for all. And this is, of course, partly because as a national priority, housing is also seen as an engine of growth. It's seen as a driver of the national economy. And I'd like to actually shed a little bit of light on the blind spot in the housing market, the real estate market, particularly in housing, that evades our perspective. And that is where people find their own solutions, where they do this in a diverse way and develop their own Eigenart. But it's also a response to rental markets, where we've heard also this morning or earlier that people in Germany are renting themselves into poverty. But I'd like to also link this to some of the commitments that have been with us for well over 40 years, particularly in the Habitat Agenda. And as a representative of the Habitat International Coalition, I'd just like to point out that that coalition has been standing for the last 40 years. It's a coalition of about 400 member organizations, non-governmental organizations. Among them, at the last count, 103 are academic centers. But the combination of the statisticians and the analysts and the people's solutions is really what I like to focus on. In addition, as we've also heard from Professor Schechla, as well as from Leilani Farha, there is a lack of a normative framework, certainly in the Habitat Agenda, at the level that we would expect it to be. And so I want to just focus a little bit on what we normally see as the housing market. and how vital it is to the economy. In the United States, for example, where there's plenty of statistical data, we have generally understanding that between 17 and 18% of GNP is produced by the housing market. This is in part, of course, the multiplier effect of investment in housing, at least the investment in housing that is counted in formal statistics. In OECD countries, construction of new houses and repair of old ones together create about 6% of all jobs. This is another aspect, the job creation that comes with the housing market. Every new median-priced house in California generates about $375,000 in extra economic activity and creates 2.1 new jobs for each home. These data sets are not easily available in developing countries, in Africa, for example, but in South Africa, where data do exist, the formal housing market contributes to about 10.9%. And these data are actually after the mortgage crisis. So these are not inflated or linked to the previous era. It takes about 1,289 continuous man-hours of labor in South Africa to build a 40-meter square house. And in the Philippines, every peso spent generates another 16.1 pesos to the GNP. In the formal housing market in South Africa, every $1 equivalent spent generates about 7.83, that is $7.83 to the economy. And in Argentina, 1 million pesos spent in housing construction leads to 1.9 million in demand. And there are similar figures in the literature concerning studies of the housing market in Scotland, in Toronto, and elsewhere. Now, these relationships vary in their stability and their strength and their quality and the types of contributions they make to the economy. They are very contextual in nature. But as we've already heard, and also from Minister Hendricks, a similar statistic that about 70% of African people in Africa build their own solutions. They build in the informal sector. They're completely uncounted in the market. And so what I'd like to show you is actually the results of a rare study that was conducted by Rooftops Canada and the Finnmark Trust. That shows that in 7 countries that were surveyed, there was a multiplier effect, an economic multiplier effect that showed for every dollar equivalent spent in the housing market, these were the figures that showed a range from $5.35 generated from every dollar spent in the housing market in Tanzania to as much as $18.35 in South Africa. So where it's possible also to measure, there are statistics that can come forward to show us what's actually happening in both the formal and informal markets. So this study covered both formal and informal markets. Job creation is the other very important consequence. And we find that in Kenya, for example, there was actually, in Tanzania, there was actually more jobs developed in the informal housing market than in the formal housing market. And there are comparable figures across the board. This is not found in the statistics that we normally see in housing studies. I want to point to another example that also comes from the Habitat International Coalition's experience, and this comes from Mexico. There was a rare, actually a sort of an exceptional study, the first of its kind, to measure the informal sector contribution to the housing stock in Mexico over a period in the first half of the first decade of the new millennium. So as of 2006, we actually show that among the total stock of housing in the country, which is 24,137,375 units, the social production of housing, that is the informal sector of housing production, was 15 million. And when we talk about estamos presentes, this is a prime example of that in statistical form. So where we have a breakdown of social production of habitat and housing compared with the investment of the private sector, the investment of owners themselves, but this is also formal, and also from the government or from the public sector. It reflects actually a trend that is global. And this is the blind spot that I would like to refer to, and it has a name. We have a definition in our coalition for social production of habitat. This is the non-market processes carried out under inhabitants' initiative, innovation also, by the way, management and control that generate and or improve adequate living spaces, housing, and other elements of physical and social development. It doesn't have to be only the physical space. There's social production of housing, but also social production of habitat, which is a broader sense. Now, I want to just point to this definition because it's agreed upon globally. And it's important largely because it took 16 years for the actors in the social production of habitat to agree on this definition. So we hold it very dear. Now, I'd like to also make a link, a very important link to Habitat 3 and the new urban agenda as I close. And that is to sort of crown the 40 years of commitments from Habitat 1 in 1976 to Habitat 2 in 1996, and then to Habitat 3 in the new urban agenda in 2016. There are many commitments to support for community-generated housing solutions, support for community initiatives. Whatever term you want to attribute, this has been a long-standing commitment of governments and states who are obliged under treaty and international law to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to adequate housing. But in the process toward Habitat 3, at least one of the urban thinkers campuses in Barcelona in November 2015 came up with a report and a very formal recommendation calling for the renewal of standing habitat agenda commitments to combat homelessness and to state-supported social production of habitat. And they even gave it an acronym. So in order to implement policies that guarantee appropriate access to land, adequate financing schemes, and technical assistance, where we consider that urban planning is a public good and service inherent in the normative content of the human right to adequate housing. And so social production of habitat actually appears in the new urban agenda. There are many shortcomings, but this is actually a happy consequence. And the states and their governments said, we commit ourselves to promoting the role of affordable and sustainable housing and housing finance, including social habitat production in economic development. It's important to know what that phrase means. And it means people's solutions, people's initiatives that are so far not counted in formal statistics. And we have seen from various countries, and especially from the case of Mexico, how social production far outshines the production of any sector that is subject to formal statistics. So I'll go back to the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the human right to adequate housing, and states, in fact, do bear very specific obligations, and to apply the methodology, the discipline of law, discipline of public law, and the methodology of human rights. That means that states and their governments must respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to adequate housing. Respect means to avoid or refrain from violating the human right to adequate housing. Protect means to ensure that other parties, third parties, do not violate that right. But fulfill is a very important aspect defined in law as having three elements: to promote, to facilitate, and to assist. And what the Urban Thinkers Campus in Barcelona a year and a half ago produced was a recommendation that is completely consistent with the obligation to fulfill, where the state and its institutions, including government, should promote and, of course, facilitate by providing access to land, access to urban planning, regulation, finance schemes, as were already committed 40 years ago. And, of course, to assist in a positive way. And this brings us to the important question I want to add. When we reconsider the capacity, the actual output of social production of habitat, it forces us to rethink public-private partnerships and to restore the missing P to that alliterative acronym: public-private popular partnerships, or public-popular partnerships, but not to leave out the people. And I just show in this slide some logos of organizations that are working on principles for public-private partnerships, including the former organization Comunitas, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, the OECD, and none of those principles actually include the people and social production of habitat. Realizing the potential is what we also try to do to ensure that we rethink some of these policy proposals, such as public-private popular partnerships. And so I'd like to leave you with that proposal going forward, that we rethink formal and informal housing, the way we read statistics, what we see on the ground, who is building the city, and how we relate to and respect that very natural human activity with its own Eigenart. Thank you very much.
Before we start with our discussion, let me add one last thing. I was impolite enough to not even introduce myself. So my name is Pittel. I'm a member of the WBGU, of the Advisory Council for Global Change, and I'm also a professor for economics at the University of Munich and director of the IFO Center for Resources, Climate and Energy. So I'm coming more from the energy and the climate perspective, and of course urbanization has so much to do with the prospects of that, as Dirk Messner showed us earlier on. And I mean, I was really intrigued by this literature when I kind of got into it more and more, and about also the role and the dimension of international financing in that area. And of course, to me, it was just also, I mean, there's more questions popping up than you can probably answer in one of these discussion rounds. But one for me was also, it's like, what is really the impact of this being a global market, a financial global market, versus having like national or local actors who are owning the companies? And how do I get this under control? I mean, it's a global market. We all know how difficult it is to regulate global markets. And on the other hand, of course, you don't want entire investment behavior to completely close down. So you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, at least a little bit, it seems like that. So perhaps you can say something on that.
Well, I think we can't just think about it as a market. You know, there is an extractive moment in there. There is a lot of stuff happening. So the extractive moment is when you pull out some properties and put them into the high finance. What does that mean? So for instance, the example that I like to give is when several of the key banks, Goldman Sachs was just one of them, took over 14.5 million mortgages that were invented instruments that all they wanted was to have the materiality. And the way to think about it is not, by the way, this is happening in Germany, over 1 million properties. But let me, so the notion is, this is not about housing. This is about creating a sort of, if you want a park, you know, a big space with enough materialities in there that you can generate asset-backed securities. Asset being, in this case, a material good, which the high investment circuit told the financiers, we have enough of derivatives based on other derivatives. Give me some asset-backed securities. Right now, by the way, footnote, you know who is the main buyer of troubled mortgages in the United States? And troubled mortgages tend to be, not exclusively, but they tend to be modest mortgages. They can also be mortgages on buildings. Goldman Sachs. They started buying them up ravenously. My English fails me, you know what I mean, right? Buy. And it was an innovation. And so one has to then ask oneself, what are they doing? They're not just buying failed mortgages. They are buying something else. And so, I mean, just to give you another example. So I was doing some field work, my nose was there, and I said, something is happening with aluminum, and I know that a financial firm is involved. Truckers, do I have 2 minutes? Truckers were telling me, you know, I don't know what's happening, but I'm moving around these huge sheets of aluminum several times a week. Okay, so what had happened? Goldman Sachs, I don't mean to hit on Goldman Sachs, by the way. You know, there are some very nice, some of my best friends are physicists who work in Goldman Sachs. They are just extraordinarily innovative. That is why I wind up talking so much about them. And so Goldman Sachs had managed to buy 40% of the available aluminum. Now, this is not about aluminum. This is about the commodity markets and maybe even higher markets than that. So they were delaying delivery of aluminum, which in the financial markets registers shortage, crises, etc. So the prices of aluminum went up, and they had to go to court. They were indicted. They of course got out of it. But can you understand what we are talking about? So when did people understand this example or not? Did you get it? In other words, all this materiality, it's not about the aluminum. It's about extracting a gain that in this case you got by creating a crisis in the supply of, and then in between having these truckers moving around. I mean, do you understand the levels at which they operate? So now they are the main buyers of all the mortgages. There are dodgy mortgages. So I don't know exactly what they're going to do with it, but I know they're going to do something with it. So the mortgages, 14.5 million that I was talking about, you have to imagine it's a huge field where all this material stuff goes in. It allows you to extract a piece, could be a toilet, could be a wall, whatever, create an asset-backed security. It looked like it was individual mortgages, nothing to do with that. And so what we're talking about are two radically different circuits within which, mind you, we're talking about the smallest percentage of properties. Most properties function like normal beings, let's say, who are subjected to these extraordinary manipulations. You know, I mean, that is one way of, there's much more to be said, but I just want to, and remember the figure that I showed you, the values that we're talking about. Now, this is not simply housing markets. I just want to make clear, this is a very particular vector that uses all kinds, I mean, they can do it with student debt. So student debt in the United States today is $1 trillion. A law was passed that means that those students will never get rid of that debt. They have to pay it for the rest of their lives. So the traditional bank doesn't know what to do. $1 trillion of debt, what do I do with that? Finance? $1 trillion? I can work with that. And they're working with it. And then they influence the shaping of a law in Congress. I mean, the United States is particularly bad. You know, I think Germany is much better than that. But these are very extreme modus operandi. Huh? And they are, I always say, high finance is extractive, as is Google. You just heard about the fine that Google is getting a few billions there. They are extractive sectors. And in that sense, they are not commerce. It's something else. Okay, I'm sorry for talking so long, but I can't resist.
That's really interesting. But Stephan, you wanted to say something?
Well, I would like to add some perspective. I've been to London last year and talking to developers, and what they were saying was they really think about urbanization because they have all those dark towers. They call them dark towers because not even a bakery would be able to exist in the ground floor because there's nobody living there. So how do the developers sell those dark towers? What they did was they set up a meeting in a hotel in Singapore, and they would sell the whole tower in one weekend to individual investors, private people who want to secure part of their money in a safe haven like London. Exactly. And exactly this happened when we had the European financial crisis. The brokers in Berlin were flooded by Greek, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish investors coming into the city, buying everything. Flats with one room to the luxury flats, just to secure the money. They were fearing that they would get the drachma back, or the lira, or the pesos. So that was the driving force behind it. And I think this is, you cannot object and you cannot confront the people doing this by saying this is really bad. It's a free market, it's a capital market. And those dark towers in London, they exist, and they shouldn't exist this way. They should be regulated.
Look, you're both right, and I would say a bit too partial. I'm sure that you run a very good, productive for the city real estate operation, right? By the way you were speaking. So this is not a critique. This is not at all about how you do it. But what I am seeing is we also know from the Panama Papers how much dirty money. I mean, this is a long, old history. Very easy to cleanse your money if you buy a house, you know. So there are many vectors that are coming together. I showed you those 65,000 buildings. None of them is owned by somebody who is in London. What I didn't show was a photographer of The Guardian went inside some of these mansions, you probably know this, and showed, you could just tell that nobody was living in there for a very long time. These are just mansions, these is not towers necessarily. So there is a lot of stuff happening. Now I want to bring in another vector, and I wonder if you can, so the Saudis just bought a big part of Bosnia rural land. That was very poor land. They gave the local farmers, very poor people, a lot of money and said, you have now retired. You can go wherever you want. Now, those are beautiful fields with wheat being one of the most expensive and fancy crops. So the land question is also hanging in there. You see, I mean, I think both things are coming together in a very strong way. And okay, I stop talking.
I'm just kind of burning to ask Joseph. I was like, how do we actually get a grip on this? I mean, basically, we have the land problem, we have the international money flows. We have not only banks, as we just heard, but also direct investment by, for example, rich houses. And of course, the question then poses itself, what do we do? Is it just a symptom of a much larger problem of the financial sector, for example? I mean, what you see the empty houses, gentrification processes, bubbles, etc. Of course, very specific to the housing, to the real estate sector. But what drives it? I mean, so what do we need to do to get a grip on it?
Well, I think your question goes to the heart of what we're discussing about the financialization and the commodification of housing. And what's already been said, the objective is not the house. The objective is the return. If you have a private sector, foreign investor, or domestic investor in housing for reasons other than adequate housing and the well-being of the inhabitants, then we have to actually understand the ideological roots of that. It's also not because the Saudis are traditional farmers or just, you know, generous in nature. It's the return. And we know how extractive cash for land has been in the indigenous world and other sectors, but so it's really about the return. It's not about the thing. Now, not to jump ahead, but I'm going to just make an analogy to the question of smart cities and the investments that are taking place in developing countries. We're watching very closely, with great interest, the initiative of the African Union to make digitalization a public good. Why? Because the private sector will invest in the cities and completely ignore the rural sector, where connectivity is a question of life or death in many cases. It's not about the connectivity, it's about the return. And that is, I think, where we have to keep our focus to understand what is behind it and what is the consequence.
I mean, we have also heard from Stephan before that that many of these investments are driven by, for example, pension funds looking for interest-yielding investments. And I mean, there is probably also other interest-yielding investment out there, but which is perceived and is probably high risk. Now, the risk in the real estate sector is probably also increasing a lot through all these channels, the asset-backed securities, etc., that we see out there. So the question is really, for example, from your point as a real estate developer, can you do something? Is there responsibility that, like, your profession holds to kind of try inform, for example, investors, or to only build certain projects, refrain from others?
Well, there are a number of things. Look at this conference. If you have taken one of the people here, I guess there's nobody from the real estate world except me.
Really? Is there nobody?
Is there anybody working for a professional real estate company in this room?
You were right.
Okay, let's start here, just right here. If I go to the real estate conferences, there's nobody who would be at this conference, at the real estate conference, talking about returns, talking about speculation, talking about new asset-backed securities, and that really is a problem. So to enhance discussion between the sectors is, to me, it's key to a better understanding. And sometimes it's always between black and white and good and bad. This is not the case. The developers, they have to take over responsibility for urban areas. But today, they are restricted from responsibility. They cannot talk with the public sector. There's no discussion going on. The instruments that we have...
But here in Europe, because in Europe, I thought in Germany it's a bit different, no?
Yeah, the instruments we have, they're outdated in my view. Sort of you get zoning, you get a building permit, it's completely inefficient, and then when you start building, people get outraged because they see somebody's building something there, but the permission is granted like 2 years ago, the zoning was granted like 5 years ago, so there's no discussion going on about the better use of the cities, and also the developers, they are not taking over responsibility. So I'm not representing all those speculative guys here that are out in the real estate world. I think speculation should be banned from the real estate market. Speculation with land especially, which is really bad. I once met a Danish investor. So he bought a huge piece of land right next to the Ostbahnhof on the River Spree, unused land. And he bought it with just one idea in his head. He said, well, price here is half the price of Copenhagen, a quarter of the price of London, a tenth of the price of New York. This has to go up. He was just waiting. I know Irish farmers who made lots of money in Dublin in the real estate market, and they took the money and went to Berlin and did exactly the same, speculation on land. So this should be taxed in a way to make it very prohibitive to speculate on land. But then when you get into discussion of buildings, there should be more interaction between the sectors, between people representing the housing market and the people who want to sort of do a capital investment.
So I have one last short question, but then I'd like to turn to the audience. We're running a little bit late anyway. And so if you can think of questions you want to ask while we have these really informed and very interesting people here, feel free to ask. We will only have microphones down here, so in case you're sitting up on the balcony and would like to ask a question, I would kindly ask you to come down and then ask your question. So one very short last question. I mean, we have also heard a little bit about the problem of the role of institutions in this context, not only the state, but also local governments, etc. And in many countries, we do have problems with that. We have on the one hand problems with institutions, we have on the other hand our problems to get the necessary investment together also on the public side. It's not that easy. So is that really a case also for international cooperation? What can developed countries, perhaps countries like Germany where there is a certain sense for this kind of topic, what can they do? Yeah, I mean, whoever wants.
I'm very happy to talk about local authorities and local governments. They're not the same. Local governments are, in the participatory democracy sense, exist in Germany, but not in the country where I live. We don't have local government, and we haven't had local councils since the uprising in 2011. That's Egypt, but it's not exceptional. We would not consider in the Netherlands municipalities to be proper local governments. The mayors are appointed by the Queen or now the King. They're not elected.
In the Netherlands?
In the Netherlands.
You mean Abu Taleb was appointed by the Queen?
Yeah, well, if the Queen were sitting at the time, yes. So these are local authorities. Regardless, local authorities and local governments, whatever their form, whatever their name, bear exactly the same treaty obligations, human rights treaty obligations, as central governments do. They're common but differentiated responsibilities. This is very important for us to know, but also those local governments and cities, they have rights. There's a right of the city vis-a-vis the state. We can't consider the city to be an island unto itself. And when we look at a situation like Kenya, as we saw that 1.2% of the investment is from the local public funds. That's actually counterintuitive, because after the change of regime and the new constitution in 2010, the county system in Kenya has actually imposed or granted a great deal more authority and responsibility, including for coming up with urban agriculture plans and things. But where is the investment going? The Constitution in this case maybe is not putting its money where its mouth is, or in other countries the lack of citizenship at the local level, the lack of politics at the local level is a way of actually disempowering cities and local governments, so they can't make decisions. They're constrained from making public lands available for social production of housing and habitat. We're really forced to rethink a lot of these relationships. But I find it interesting that law students don't learn this in their normal curriculum, how local authorities are bound by treaties. But we have very recent studies. The the Advisory Committee to the Human Rights Council recently did a study on human rights and the urban poor, and of course the 2015 study on the role of local governments in the promotion and protection of human rights, making this very point, which is already in black letter law, that those local authorities have obligations, but they need to be empowered in order to actually put them into practice.
So let me look around. Are there any questions coming from the audience? We have one over here and then also over there afterwards. Starting here.
Yeah, thank you for all the interesting contributions. So my name is Diego Rybski. I have one question regarding the negative interest rates we have currently. And how does this affect speculation in the housing market? And are we in the middle of a new housing bubble?
Whoever wants to take the question.
Well, I can take first. We're not in a housing bubble. I can say this because usually you get bubbles if supply or demand is heavily, if we have an oversupply. Having a big demand is not creating a bubble here, because the bubble could only burst if there's a shortage here. So and most of the economists think that there's not a bubble being created currently. However, the wall or tsunami of capital chasing returns in real estate is creating further increases in demand for real estate, and this leads to additional supply that's coming into the market. So what we see is that everywhere in Germany, at least I can talk for Germany, developers are starting to build. All the buildings are being built and pre-sold before the tenants move in. And so I think this is really good, because the people who look for an apartment, the companies who want to be a tenant and want to rent space, they get more access to space. And in a way, I would love to see a bubble coming up for the pricing to go down again, because currently speculation on land is also enhanced, and sometimes people just wait for the land to increase instead of waiting to produce new space. Yeah. But so I don't see a problem as such. I think also if the capital markets change, if the interest rates go up, we will see a slight change in the market, but not a fundamental change.
Okay.
My name is Anka Derix from GIZ, the German Agency for International Cooperation. Thank you from my side as well for this very rich inputs, which give a very rich composition of perspectives, at least for me. I have two questions. One to Mrs. Sassen. What is your recommendation to the Mayor of London to avoid the sale of the city, or to the government of the UK? And to Mr. Schechla, what is your recommendation to the German Development Corporation on how to support the social production of habitat? Thank you.
Shall I answer? Yeah. Well, the Mayor of London has only so much power, but this Mayor, Sadiq Khan, is actually a rather determined chap. I mean person, chap is one way of putting it. And he wants very much to insert, a law is not quite, but an obligation, that when a big site is developed for multiple units of housing, that some of that housing has to be low-cost housing, or for people for low income. And for low income, not low cost, actually. So that is very nice, but it's clearly not enough. Number two, by now, so much of central London has done the job of expelling low-income, the same thing in parts of New York City, like Manhattan. So, you know, it's a bit late in the game. Now, we can't blame the current mayor, but if I understand your question correctly, really, what are the powers of a mayor? The powers of mayors vary enormously. In the case of London, the mayor has some powers. He can force the subways, the undergrounds, to run the whole night, which is great, actually, for many workers who work at night. But the real estate market is a totally different situation. So very limited options today, even if you were totally determined. Now, one wrinkle, I don't know how many people heard about the terrible fire, etc. One wrinkle is that a lot of the displaced people wound up inhabiting empty, you heard of this, right? Empty, high-end buildings in Kensington, the rich part of Kensington. And that to me is an interesting event. I don't know what the next step is, but it is interesting. It's like two worlds have not collided, but have engaged each other. What comes out of that? What imaginaries, what possibilities, what claim making? You know, I'm at that. I see more hope from those types of events than from whatever policy the mayor might try to implement. But, you know, he's doing a bit, but it's not enough.
So I think we have another question in the back there. Oh, sorry.
Just briefly, what can the German Development Corporation do? Well, I think it's what others could do as well, and that is one of the things it could do is to adopt a human rights framework, not because it's philosophically wise or charitable, but because the international norms and this normative framework that we're talking about that has been so neglected but present is replete with development, sustainable development concepts. For example, the social function of land, the social function of the city, the social function of property. Well, we'll find that in paragraphs 13 and 69 of the new urban agenda. But what does that really mean? It exists in previous urban agenda or previous habitat agendas, but also in the Constitution of Ecuador, Colombia. It's being applied, the concept of plusvalia or land value capture, to ensure that the socially produced values actually return to the most vulnerable. To upstream these lessons at the policy level is very important, but also at the level of where social production of habitat is being carried out. So since change begins in the mind, often, I think that's Hegel who said that, but it's important for us to have the ideas that come from the research. Like the examples that we have are rare, but they need to be, they need to travel, they need to be applied so that we can actually identify that blind spot in the real estate market or the housing market. If we're calling it a market, what's informal is actually dominant in the experience of people, but it's very much underreported.
Oh, I'm really sorry about that. So I think we have another question in the back. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Camilla Kors. I'm a student here in Berlin, and my question is, so besides all the regulations we have already on the housing markets, you can see, especially in popular city quarters here in Berlin, prices are getting really high. And when you think about these popular quarters, they are also popular because of their diversity regarding social and ethnic diversity. And my question is, so there are already a lot of civil movements, but what can politics in the city do to protect these characteristics of these diverse city quarters? Thanks.
Do you want anyone specific to answer, or just for anybody who wants to answer?
Maybe he knows
I would, yeah, that would be my guess.
I'm living in Berlin since 1993. I've seen all this gentrification happening in Mitte, in Prenzlauer Berg, and all those boroughs of Berlin. And it was always the same type of track. First we had the artists, the gallerists, then the restaurants came, then the companies moved in, and the crowding out of people with affordable rents. But what I see is that we really should work on adding space to those quarters instead of regulating the existing space. The problem is that the people who are living there, they cry for regulation because they have their apartments, they have their easy and cheap rents, they're there. But people want to move in, like students and others want to move in. So we have to add space, we have to add new floors to existing building, we have to densify the city in this way and to preserve also the character. This would be my solution. I know that Berlin politics is all about regulation. Establishing Milieuschutz for the Germans here, Milieuschutz into the quarters. And I think this is something, yes, you can do this, but you only help the people who have an apartment. You don't help anybody who wants to have an apartment. That is the issue, and it's about economy.
Excuse me, we have the right of free speech. Everybody can say what he wants. Okay, Saskia.
Well, I think we do confront an issue. There are big lacunae in existing law in our Western type systems. Now, I want to just talk about maybe the UK a bit and the United States. United States, serious stuff. Renters have few rights very often, though if you're very rich, then it's another matter, I guess. But the problem is that there is like a blank, a hole, which gives very few powers of making claims, not demanding, but just claim making, you know, which is part of a liberal democracy, so to speak. So I would say that we need to revisit the laws, the regulations, and the custom. You know, customary law is a big deal here too, that actually govern a lot of this issue of housing. For a very long time, let's remember that up to the 1970s, 1980s, our big cities were poor. New York was formally broke. Tokyo was broke. London was broke. Paris was broke. They were poor because the economy was happening outside of cities. Then comes this whole other, I always look at it as a sort of operational space that, yes, includes finance, but includes all kinds of other things. Intermediate economic sectors, they can never lose, that's another thing, that installs itself in these cities. And at that point, the absence of certain types of protections became an issue, and we never really addressed that stuff in the United States. I think maybe Europe has been better at that. So we really, there is law to be made, there are customs to be implemented, etc.
Okay.
It's hard work, whoever the question. Right.
So do we have another question, or yes, we need a mic here? And I think there's also after that another one in the back. And then we'll probably have to come to an end.
Yes, hello, my name is Knut Unger. I'm working with German tenant unions. And yes, our friend from Germany, from the real estate sector, he told us stories about regulation making markets not work. Yes, you said that too much regulation caused a situation that the companies escaped and that property was sold to foreign investors. The opposite is true. So we had a big story here in Germany. This was the story of the Wohnungsgemeinnützigkeit, a regulated non-for-profit sector, which was regulated by law until 1990. And this law was abolished. And then a lot of houses, millions of houses, came into this process of commodification and financialization. Without abolishing of this law, and there were other laws and other regulations that had been abolished in an offensive of 20 and 30 years of neoliberal policies, which caused a new type of market, what Saskia Sassen calls extractive, a totally different type of market because of this dysregulation. And this caused, for example, the situation that today we have more than 1 million housing units owned by corporations which I would call financialized, because they are directly acting with the global capital market and with the global financial markets. There are more than 800,000 housing units directly controlled by publicly listed companies, and the shares are traded every day. This is the financialization. This is which has happened and which is going on in Germany. And we also have the gentrification. We have a lot of investors, financial investors, engaged in gentrification, in buying up property and selling it to the next investor. And this increases rent, and we need regulation to stop this process. Of course, we also need more. We need correct regulation, and we also need additional space if the population is growing, and if we have more households, we need new housing units, of course. But we do not need these new housing units without regulation, without rent regulation. Nobody can afford houses for 20 euro a square meter in Berlin. It's horrible what is happening here. So it's really like Leilani Farha said, and this is very good that we have at least this outcome from the bad experience with the habitat-free process, that our special rapporteur has such a strict and clear language regarding the need to regulate the housing, the real estate, and the land markets. And exactly that is the question. And if we want to proceed, and if we want to solve also the problems and all the relations...
we have to finish in a couple of minutes.
Then we really have to think about the right way to regulate. The question is not regulation or not. The question is, which kind of regulations do we need to achieve the human rights and to achieve the SDGs?
I'm guessing there was a question addressed to one of the, or anyone? Just a statement, just a comment. Okay, so we just leave it at that. And we had in the back, the gentleman with the... Thanks.
Mensbun, I think it's called. Felix Hartenstein from TU Berlin. One of my favorite movies I saw recently was The Big Short, which was about the subprime crisis in the United States in 2007, 2008. And one of my favorite scenes in that movie is when some of the banking guys, they try to find out what's happening on the ground. So they go to different areas in the United States trying to find out what the real estate situation really looks like. And they end up in all of these empty suburbs. And similar things, we've seen the empty towers, the black towers in London. I know similar situations in Egypt where there are 20 plus new towns all over the country, which are all basically completely empty. And I'm sure there's similar examples all over the world. So the question I'm asking myself is, did we miss the point after 2008? So we've regulated our banking system, we've regulated the financial flows, but we haven't changed the way that we approach investment into real estate, which was fundamentally the cause of the whole crisis. And if anything, we've actually seen an increase in real estate speculation because of the zero interest rates, even more capital flowing into real estate. So aren't we actually making it worse? And have we missed the point? That's my question.
Saskia?
Very, very well put. So I think there are at least two issues in what you are saying. The crisis was not necessarily directly caused by the subprime mortgages. It was a crisis of confidence. You see, so it was a bit more complicated story. It was like suddenly this little thingy there, woof, bit back. Number two, a lot of people, a lot of financiers and corporations made a lot of money off that subprime mortgage event before the crisis hits. And those who sold their instruments immediately, you know, the high finance circuit, you buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, they made a pile of money. There is a hidden history which does not show how much wealth was generated off the backs of these modest households mostly, who then lost everything, right? So I just wanted to put that on. And so suddenly, when a few things go wrong, the high finance circuit has a crisis of confidence. And there is this ironic thing that I like to pull out, which is the little tail of the dog, whatever we call that, la cola. dogged, these modest households, they were mostly modest households, created the crises for this very powerful sector. Now that's one point. Second point, quantitative easing. You understand that in the United States, quantitative easing is a terribly elegant term for something that is far less elegant than it sounds, right? So we actually wind up generating $7 trillion through quantitative easing that went straight to the big banks, not to the little banks. So many things are coming together. Secondly, when we were debating during the crises in 2009, there was a big meeting, public meeting in Congress. The legislature decided we are going to transfer, pay attention to this number, $300 billion to the big banks. In the meantime, secretly, our Federal Reserve, the central bank, transferred another separate $7 trillion to the global banking system. Bloomberg News puts in a request for information because I also suspected, I knew that something was happening, and so it took 2.5 years for our central bank to respond to this request. When that information came out, here is what the FT, the Financial Times, front page that almost nobody saw, because it was so extreme that most readers who read the Financial Times regularly said, I don't know what I'm reading, so they moved on. But the FT showed, and it showed 21,000 requests, including French banks, German banks, Swiss banks, whatever you name it, Dutch banks. Thank you for the cheap money of the United States. It's like the window, 21,000 plus requests. So the issue of the mortgages, is one thing, little tail that wiped a very powerful system and created a crisis of confidence. The irony is that that crisis of confidence enabled the big banks to generate that passing of money. So in total, we have passed on $14 trillion to some big corporations hanging in there and to a lot of banks. And the FT has a cover page, now it came out several years ago, which gives you all the detail. So if there is one interesting datum vis-a-vis all the 14 little mortgages, so to say, it is the fact of how a not very powerful event could generate such a crisis of confidence in such a powerful system that then ironically led to giving even more to the banks. The low interest rates are linked to that. So the low interest, the mortgages had only so much of a role. They were an interesting event, but and they tell us a big story here, a tale about a bigger condition. But the actual, what actually happened is a horror story. I mean, it really, when you see the details, you can't believe it. I don't know if anybody followed what I just said. You get the idea, though, right? It was really bad.
Okay, so we're running late. We have about 5 minutes to 4, and then we have a break until 4:30. So I'm just assuming that you would be okay with me using 5 more minutes. And because I had 2 more questions that I saw the last time I looked up, I would ask the 2 of you to make it very short, and then we can have a very short answer because Saskia also has to go to the airport, and it would be really... So she wanted to leave discreetly. I said, I just messed that up. I'm sorry. So, but 2 more short questions. We had 1 in the back and 1 up front here.
Hi. Hello? Okay. Hi, I'm also a student at the Technical University. My question, forgive me if it's a bit of trying to make a bit of a point as well, but I'll cut it short. Basically, one aspect I want to talk about is I noticed that both Mr. Bone-Winkel and Mr. Schechla talked a lot about jobs. And especially Mr. Bone-Winkel, you were mentioning that we should talk about jobs and not housing. We should talk about job creation, not housing. Isn't the fact that we're talking about housing, though, a reaction to the way that we have to survive with these jobs that we have nowadays? This promise of jobs, I'm just asking myself, how is that a promise that people can still believe in? Because we have to look at the wage development that is leading to people not being able to afford housing anymore. It is linked in the fact that wage development does not allow us to reproduce socially to the full extent that we're promised to, that we can with these jobs. So I'm just asking myself, how is that a narrative, a promise that you're telling us here that we can actually still believe in? And the other question, or a point I just quickly want to make, is the same thing about jobs in the informal sector. I promise, really short. Informal sector jobs can mean anything. How is that an absolute value that we can try to achieve? Because selling tissue papers in a slum is also an informal job. It doesn't create any value. It's just a job to be occupied, to have some kind of form of wage. So I'm asking...
Let me just collect the two questions and then we have the answer. So
Thanks.
Second question, short, do you still want to ask or?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm inhabitant of Berlin, and I can't really follow quite well the way of your discussion, but I have one concrete question. What are your suggestions to avoid what was going on with Venedig? I mean, there are some candidates who are going the same way. And what would be possible to avoid the sand stealing all over the world? For example, on the beaches where we want to travel and to pass our vacancies. Thanks.
So we had first one on the jobs and the informal sector. That's on Venice, I think it was, yeah. So the first one was on the jobs issue and the informal sector. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I would like to talk about the job issue. I think we can all agree about analysis of the problem, and I think we can disagree about the solutions to the problem. The problem is that we need more housing, that we need more affordable housing, and that we need more good jobs in a city. And that's why cities prosper, because there's this hope for jobs. And I personally work with a lot of companies in the commercial property sector, and they all have the same issue. They come here into the cities to get the talented people. That's why Berlin is so attractive, because there's this huge pool of talent here. And at the same time they say, well, what I pay in Berlin is half what I have to pay in London, for instance. So that's why Berlin is so attractive. So the problem, I think we can agree upon. The solution to the problem, in my view, it's my personal view, is not to restrict the access to space. My solution would be to ask investors to invest more into space, because if you increase supply, it gets cheaper, and if you increase supply, you have more space that you can then fill up with people moving into the city. So that's my solution. The other solution might be restricting supply. That's okay. And that's a very political way to do it. And it's a discussion, a debate we should be doing. And I'm really hoping that there will be more discussion between the real estate world and the political world, or the housing world. We have to enhance this and find solutions together.
And then we have the final question on Venice, development in Venice and sand stealing. Do you want to take that one? At least the Venice part?
I want to talk about jobs. I want to talk about a strong stream of jobs, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Because it's a very important question, and I think that, again, we have the need to apply a normative framework. As I said about these relationships between contribution of the housing sector to GNP and job growth, these are very different in their stability and the quality of those relationships, those correlations. But one thing that is missing in the analysis that I shared from 7 countries in Africa, it spoke about job creation in the formal and informal sector, but it did not apply any decent work criteria. And we have the norm of decent work. We have to also test, was that in a context of occupational safety and health? Did it involve child labor? Did it provide social protection? All of these questions. Was it a living wage? So I think we have to go deeper into this question, especially when we talk about job creation in any sector. There's a lot of loosey-goosey analysis going on. And we'll hear from the International Real Estate Federation, the United States National House Builders Association, this mantra about how jobs are the natural consequence of growth in their vested interest. We have to really evaluate these things more deeply.
So, is there anybody wants to say something on Venice? And I think you referred to the fact that there's a lot of buying up of apartments which are then empty. Yeah.
You're talking.
It's kind of the empty tower phenomenon. Yeah.
But see, I mean, the issue with Venice is how it is being abused by the tourist industry. That is a major, major issue. All the big ships that create all the waves, the tourists who come and really don't produce anything. So you know, that is right now the major crisis, I think, that is being added. The emptiness of Venice, that's a whole other story. I mean, that you know, many of those palaces are actually inhabited, but only for very short periods of time. I mean, yeah, I would have loved to talk also more about jobs and stuff, but I think the end has come. That's certainly for me.
I'm getting this pleading look for last sentence, so.
To me, a theme keeps recurring, and that is linked to this concept of the social function of property, land, housing. And I hate to give examples from Brazil these days, but over the years, Sao Paulo has developed regulations that are actually very interesting, whereby a dark tower will be highly taxed if it's not inhabited for 6 months, and eventually there will be the right for unhoused or underhoused people to claim the social function to provide adequate housing for them. I live in Cairo with a tower in front of me, 30 stories. It's 70% empty, and I look at that every day. I mean, of course, it blocks a beautiful view. We'd like to take a bazooka to it, but it's really a symbol of exactly this problem. We have houses with no inhabitants and inhabitants with no houses.
So I would like to thank our panelists very much for this interesting discussion, for this inspiring discussion, and also for the very diverse points of view. So I really enjoyed that very much, and I think also our audience profited very much from that. I also want to thank our audience for the questions they asked, and also for bearing with me in kind of like letting this run late for more than 15 minutes, but I thought the discussion was interesting enough to warrant it. So we'll see each other again at 4:30, and then we will have the keynote presentation of the conference.